So I finished my cup of tea and I thought this would be a good time to talk about The Colonizer and the Colonized, which is a book I finished just a few days ago at the airport. I had started reading this during term time, and this was the second book as part of my Decolonize the Curriculum of My Mind project. The first was Discourses on Colonialism by Amy Césaire, and this was the second book. I was very excited to read this, and when I finished it, it sparked a lot of interesting ideas. A lot of them had nothing really much to do with colonialism, but a lot of them were linked to philosophies alongside colonialism. What I mean by this is that there are concerns that I believe preoccupy my mind. Concerns that are linked to different kinds of oppression, let's say. And some of them are colonial, others are to do with sexism and the patriarchy. And I feel that all of these different oppressive philosophies come together, often in like very married ways, in order to make my life very constrained. I think that there is a difference between individual action versus collective power. And I heard Zizek and Jordan Peterson's debate, kind of, not in front of each other as far as I can tell, but Zizek found Peterson's philosophy to be kind of flawed. Jordan Peterson advocates for cleaning your own room and taking individual responsibility. Zizek argued that it is cultural forces that are at play that can cause an individual to be repressed. And I don't disagree with him exactly. I don't think that he's getting what Dr. Peterson's arguing. I think Dr. Peterson's argument or point is not against the power of collective authority, but rather the power of individual autonomy as a goal on its own. But I do think that there's something fruitful in what Zizek is saying, because I do think that the kind of culture that exists allows an individual to express themselves in certain ways. For example, our society is very much focused on social media, on distractions, on drugs, on vanity, on accumulation of goods. And when you are someone who does drugs, buys lots of things, feels very lonely, is very vain, posts on social media, you are participating in different kinds of sicknesses, in my opinion, but you are the natural byproduct of a sick society. So if you are someone who doesn't do these things, who doesn't participate with social media, who maybe cultivates themselves and who is honest and chooses vulnerability over vanity, and someone who aspires to be brave and good rather than just provocative and beautiful, I think that people will think you are off and they will punish you for it, even though you are a healthy individual who has managed to exist in spite of an unhealthy society. I believe that individuals are punished for breaking free from the norm in that sense. But I think that such individuals are exceptional, and I count myself among them. And I try every day to aspire to such an individual through impulse and action. But sometimes I think about this idea Zizek has about how easy it is to be a sick individual when you come from a sick society. In that context, I think that I accept Zizek's argument. I accept that there are cultural forces at play that work to sort of facilitate crude impulses I might have, base impulses. But I also agree with Dr. Peterson. I think that there is something to individual psychology, and I think that constantly sort of relying upon the culture to define yourself can be either in opposition or in accordance with it, can be sort of reductive, and I think there are limits to what you are able to achieve. Whereas I think if you see yourself as an individual person, I suppose it's also reductive because you're not considering the role of socio-historical forces in shaping how you act, like your family or the culture at large, the social culture at large. nationalistic, ethnic, etc., gender culture, all kinds of cultures. Like, yeah, I think that that does have to do with it. So it's part psychology and it's part cultural forces, I think, that constrain me. You might think, well, you are very concerned with being constrained. So naturally, you feel constrained because you believe there are all these, ghosts out there who are trying to like shame you and constrain you. Um, so that's why you feel oppressed, because you accept that as a premise. And if you reject the hypothesis of oppression, then perhaps you would not be a victim to it. But I don't think that's true. I think it's very powerful. I think it's very powerful to articulate the language, to have a language to articulate how you've been oppressed, to like formulate it into words and gestures and experiences and ideas, to have an intellectual argument against it, to poke fun at it, to be conscious of it, and to like not pretend like it's not there. Because when I read discourses on colonialism, before I had even finished it, I noticed changes in my life. I noticed that there were people who previously had impressed me at university who were no longer impressing me. Freudian slip right there. And something similar happened with Colonizer and the Colonized. As I read through it, there were many times when I felt like, wow, colonialism is like really deep rooted. And that's another alignment with a different philosophy. So like I was telling you, there are different philosophies that I believe oppress me. One of them is the colonial philosophy, and the other one is the patriarchy. So Susan Sontag's book on women is the one book I read just before The Colonizer and the Colonized, and she draws an interesting alignment. She says that the women of her society and country, I think she's talking about women at large though, she says that women socially, in a universal sense, are ostracized as if they are a different race. And this is the same with colonialism. So she draws a parallel between the oppression that the patriarchy exerts over women and the oppression that the colonizer exerts over the colonized. And the more I thought about this, the more interesting it became, not just as a lens to understand the patriarchy, but also as a lens to understand colonialism. So, for instance, I'm familiar with the idea of, boy, am I familiar in every way through intellectual exertion and practice. I am very familiar with the idea of internalized misogyny. Now, if there's internalized misogyny, I think there's also internalized colonial thought. And have seen how nefarious both of these institutions are. In discourses on colonialism, Césaire talks about how it does not matter, and this is the part of the book I think that's really like stuck out to me. This and the whole bit about like how people will talk about cotton and spice and things, but what they miss, of course, is the extraordinary potential these areas had that they were not allowed to develop, and how sad that is, and how unjust that is. But the second thing I found so interesting about that book was that he says that it does not matter what individual persons feel. It doesn't matter whether in the private conscience of, say, Peter or John, whether or not they succumb to colonial impulses. What work they do, what damage that they are able to enact as watchdogs of colonialism is far more nefarious. And I was thinking about this because my friend had said to me that there is no one who upholds patriarchal institutions more than matriarchs, than old women, than individuals who have been the most oppressed by the patriarchy and who stand to gain the most by being perhaps liberated from it. And I was thinking about all those ideas, and I found that really interesting because when I considered Césaire's idea about it not mattering much what individual persons feel, initially was very compelling to me. I liked the the naming of a Peter and a John, because I do think that I had that propensity to, when I met someone, to wonder whether they too were guilty of viewing people in this manner. And the suggestion that doesn't really much matter, initially I found it like compelling when Césaire presented it to me. But the more I think about it, I think no, I think it is important to like ponder like individual people, because I think when you reduce individuals to like this particular group of like watchdogs of colonialism, people who enact suffering on behalf of institution, consciously or subconsciously, and you suggest it doesn't matter what they personally think, I think that like you really dehumanize them and you almost legitimize their power. Because when you dehumanize someone, you suggest that they are not to be, they're not subject to the same laws as everybody else, like moral or physical. And I think that that's not the case at all. I think that individuals are capable of great evil and good, and the colonizer is not exempt from that. That is what I noticed as well in this book, a problem, you might say, I had, which was that this book identified these two groups, right? The colonizer and the colonized. And the problem I had with this dichotomy, let's say, was that it's very general. And I understand that perhaps it is helpful to deal in generalities in that way when we know who we're talking about. Like, it's not that, vague of a term to say colonizer and colonized when we know that can refer to many different peoples. But the whole book itself is very general. It's very much theory based. It does point every now and then to this or that revolution, and I don't like books that, I was not in the mood for this type of book, at least right now, where there are constantly statistics being provided and there's a definition. I think of Orientalism by Edward Said, and I think that's so verbose and dense as a book. Never finished it and never even really started it, but I know it's interesting and I know ideas about that are cool. But I just think that this book could really have benefited from talking about these groups, the colonizer and the colonized, with more specificity and with more of an analytical gaze rather than merely a moralistic one. So I found this particularly interesting because in the sense of like having this group of individuals emphasized, because like the colonizer and the colonized, that is the oppressor and the oppressed. And Sontag uses the feminist struggle as something that she compares to colonialism. And what I find interesting about this book is that it compares the colonial struggle to the class struggle, the people-to-people relationship within nations. Remind one of the bourgeoisie proletariat relationship within a nation. And this idea of like it all coming back to class, because it felt that way to me at least. I read Sontag goes feminism, colonialism, I read colonialism, I go colonialism, class, and it feels like often, like when you consider patriarchy, you're suggested that, oh, the reason women are oppressed is because it's commercial. Like, women were given the right to vote according to figures like Candace Owens, who are on the conservative side of the American political spectrum. They were given the right to vote and to take up jobs so that the government could tax a household twice. Then I learned that the feminist movement was funded by the CIA, which was like interesting. I didn't know that. I wonder what the implications of that are. It's almost very colonial, isn't it? Because we are inclined to think of like the CIA as a bad institution, right? They're like the villains in our eyes. So when the CIA says that something is good, we have to push against it, right? But the feminist movement, in my eyes, is like a really good struggle and like it did positive work. So, does that mean that the CIA is good? I don't know. I think of it like happenstance, like two events that coincide. That's how I think about certain eradication of practices like sati, which is when widows would burn themselves alive following grief in certain groups of Indians pre-partition, and the British put an end to that in the Indian subcontinent. And I think that's like a positive thing. Some people point to cotton and railways, don't agree with that, just because I don't think they contributed much, and whatever they contributed, they also destroyed so much, and they also didn't allow a lot of stuff to happen. So I believe that it's like good that happens to coincide, doesn't justify the institution. Like if you set about to kill someone, like if I walk up to a person with the intent of punching them in the face, but actually they had like a broken limb already, and I managed to kick them in just the right spot that it straightens their limb, that doesn't mean that I'm a good person. It just means that good things happen to coincide with my evil, nefarious acts. In any case, class. It's all just come back to class, because with the patriarchy, of course, like I was saying, on the conservative side, class is what guides it there. In fact, if you go to Candace Owens' video, where it's like Candace Owens, like one conservative versus like 50 feminists or something on Jubilee, you will notice a lot of her points are very much based on class rather than gender. Like a lot of her concerns and critiques seem to be of the capitalist system more than a destabilization or like pushback or decryment, I guess, against the feminist struggle. So there's that. On the liberal end of the spectrum, of course, I don't mean to like, I do think a lot of liberals are young and misinformed. There are also conservatives who are young and misinformed, which I learned this year because I joined the Conservative Society at my university. And I realized that a lot of them are very, well, everybody's like just like a spokesperson of their parents' opinions. Perhaps I am too in a different sense, but I like to think for myself, and I'm conscious of that. They proudly, from birth, have spouted their parents' opinions, it feels like. In any case, a lot of the uninformed, radical left, let's say, it's an unfair characterization, kind of. Because I just said conservatives, and now I'm like saying unhappy things about the left. But in any case, the left have the tendency of also pointing towards capitalism as like the root cause of all evil and suffering in this world. And I point to Mrs. Sontag's sort of assessment on the matter. She suggests that a lot of radical feminists will ensure that discourse suffering at all points it made come back to this unifying like point of gender. Like all suffering comes back to that. And that's reductive, so nobody should do that. In any case, I found what was one thing that was really cool about this book was that it provided me with a humorous perspective on the guy that I recently broke up with. This really reminded me. For this, in my eyes, for him, a brief stay in a colony, a few conversations, or simply a hasty glance over the press or a so-called colonial novel would suffice. The eulogizing of oneself and one's fellows, the repeated, even earnest affirmation of the excellence of one's ways and institutions, one's cultural and technical superiority, do not erase the fundamental condemnation which every colonialist carries in his heart. I like that so much as well. The excesses of his vanity, the too magnificent portrait he paints of himself, betray him more than serve him. He has always been directing attention beyond himself. He seeks this final refuge in his mother country. I thought this was so cool, and like the gulf between the culture, the exploitation of these differences for the benefit of the colonialist, the use of these supposed differences as standards of absolute fact. He who knows that he is in a bad ideological or ethical position generally boasts of being a man of action, one who draws his experiences, his lesson from experiences. And just like a charitable racism, a paternalist is one who wants to stretch racism and inequality further, once admitted. It is, if you like, a charitable racism, which is not thereby less skillful nor less profitable, for the most generous paternalism revolts as soon as the colonized demands his union rights. And if he increases his wages, if his wife looks after the colonized, these are gifts and never duties. I thought this was so cool because especially this whole idea about like gift versus duty, because I think that one important thing in a relationship is commitment. You look at the other person, you say, I commit to you, I agree to only see you, and I agree to have this publicly acknowledged in front of everybody. And when you're dating someone at college, it's a bit like getting married, isn't it? You're saying in front of the church, that is our university, in front of all our friends and family, that is our dorm mates and acquaintances, I recognize you and you will appear alongside me. I heard someone say that you need to start choosing men like they are co-owners of your company. I think that's an interesting way of putting it, and I think it's also a very powerful way of putting it, because brand image matters. And I was kind of thinking, oh, it doesn't matter, I can sort with all sorts of people, so it doesn't have to be someone incredible. But I thought, no, a romantic person, a romantic partner, should be someone who can represent your brand. I heard someone else say that, like, how we feel about ourselves says a great deal about how other people have felt about us in the past. And I think about this all the time. I think about how the way that I see myself is so shaped by how my parents and the girls at my school and the boys that I've dated and the people who engage with my content, how they have seen me has like determined my image of myself. And I feel like I don't see myself very clearly, because sometimes when I'm speaking, I'll have these flashes, these moments when I make a very good point or something. I'll think, wow, she's so cool. How could anyone ever touch a girl? She is so talented, and like she has a whole history. Like nobody knows I have this YouTube channel. I write stories online. I can play the piano, and I read widely and across different genres. I debate. Um, I used to create art. I'm getting back into it. I write a great deal, and I'm also a great friend, and I also like to dress up. Like, I'm talented, and I think I'm just very talented, and I think I'm also very dynamic. But other times I will look at myself when I'm speaking and I will feel like she's not dressed properly. I don't like how, the camera I set up. I don't like how there's like too much light in this room. I don't like this or that, and she is trying too hard. I came across this journal I'd written when I was 19, and it was written on my 19th birthday. It was like a record of my day, my first impressions pre, during, and um, a few hours after being at 19. The early stages of 19. And it was like, I was looking at this and I felt mortified, especially because my room has been such a mess recently. So, like, seeing it, I just suddenly felt this shame that I haven't felt in a very long time. And I think that that's not a bad thing, you know? I'm trying to reframe it. When I feel these feelings arise of like feelings that I haven't felt in many, many years, I think they're triggered by being back home or being in a situation which feels like being compromised in some way. I think I take this as an invitation to think about that very deeply and to make an effort to cater to that part of myself. Because there are all these different versions of me inside me. And as I become a woman, not a girl, a woman, a person, um, it's important to recognize all those parts of me and cater to them, because they're all living inside me constantly, like Russian dolls. And I describe myself as a woman because I'd seen myself as a person for a long time, until at some point I decided I was a girl. I decided this because being a girl was how I was being treated. I was told I was like naive. Um, Many people didn't have much faith in me. I was acting in very girlish ways, and my romantic partners also rewarded infantilism because they needed to have someone small so they could look big. Also has to do with the fact that I dated lots of short men. I want to stop doing that. But anyway, what does that have to do with the colonized and the colonized? Yes, this book gave me a fantastic framework for thinking about the guy I was seeing, and it made me find him funny. It made me see how cruel he is and also how full of shit he is, which is something I don't think, I don't know. I think uh, as time goes by and you think about a relationship that you were just in, I think that you have these glimpses. You think of a moment which at the time just kind of went by, but you think back on that moment, you think, wow, that was like really awful, or that was a very mean thing to do. And like as time goes by, you are able to get a lot of clarity on what a situation is like. And I think like when you're in it, it's hard sometimes to see. But when you've definitely closed that chapter, it's easier to see like what went wrong as time goes by. I think last time I was back home, I was still seeing this guy. So you would think that like physical distance would give me clarity, and to some extent, in some areas, it did. But because I hadn't stopped seeing him, and I was still entertaining him as a possibility, still trying to convince him, still trying to get somewhere and see if progress can be made, still holding on, it was hard to see like this and that was bad. That was really bad actually. But now that I've said no to him completely, I feel really free, because not only can I see clearly all the ways that he was very cruel, but also I'm able to stop wanting him. He hasn't messaged, like I've deleted his chat, so I don't receive like messages, memes, and things from him, and it doesn't feel awful. Like I thought that would be like terrifying, but I don't receive those messages. Partly because I deleted him, and partly it's just like I'm not seeing him anymore. So it's okay. I don't know. It's I thought I'd care a lot, but I didn't. Is my point. One of my points at least. And reading this book was really powerful because it like allowed me to see him as he is. I was speaking to this girl who is the girlfriend of that guy's best friend, and she told me that, you know, her boyfriend had told her that the guy I was with was very cruel to me. And I said, did he say this to you, that like he was very cruel to me? And she said, no, my boyfriend said this to me. And I don't like her boyfriend. I think he's just like the guy I was with in many ways, but just like less glamorous and handsome and kind and other qualities I liked in the guy I was seeing. But that description, he was very cruel to her. I found that very compelling and kind of almost softened my heart for this guy, because suddenly I was able to see that situation from the outside in. You know, suddenly when a third person said he was very cruel to you, my mother could have said this to me. I think it had perhaps a similar effect. But the fact that someone had said this, that he was very cruel to you, I really found that to be a little bit compelling, a little bit moving, and it made me think, yes, he was very cruel to me. And I think about his conduct, and I think that was a very odd, strange thing to do. Like, I'm thinking now about the way that he viewed me. He saw me as someone, you know, conveniently, who was strange and severe, and what else? Strange, severe, too many high standards, that sort of thing. And I think that perhaps the criticisms he was offering me were reflections of who he truly was. Because I think about these words. I think about the word severe, for instance. And I think that if you saw like his free-spirited behavior, it wouldn't come across as severe, but there was a severity to how he deal with the vulnerability of others. The word strange, the word odd, I think about like there was something very like disconcerting and senile about like how he'd conduct himself. And like I think about all this, and it just like, I don't know, it kind of makes me think that like not just under that personal lens, but also under the colonial lens. That's kind of what the colonizer does, doesn't he? He kind of speaks to the colonized with this paternalism, and he treats the colonizer as the savage. But really, there's nothing more savage than an individual or a group of individuals who seek to exploit the natural resources of an entire culture and raise it to the ground. Like, that is the most savage thing you can do, and savage and uncivilized is the word that comes to mind when one thinks of how people talk about the colonized. I think that the colonizer always ascribes those qualities to the colonized because that's exactly who he is. My sister suggested to me that like she's the one who kind of recommended I read more about colonialism, and I made it into a larger project: religious and cultural readings about how women are oppressed, readings about how colonialism works, readings about why my country is really cool and the history of my country, readings about religion, different religions, exposure to different philosophies, exposure to art, and all of these cultural and religious readings were to expand my mind. But the first book I started reading, aside from the Quran maybe, or did I start that after? No, I think before the Quran I started reading discourses on colonialism. And I think that reading these books, my sister recommended them to help me understand certain mechanisms that exist around me. But she also warned me that I should not be sort of like caught up in them, and it's reductive, it's only helpful to a certain extent. And I partly agree with this. I mean, I think about it, and I think about how colonialism works, and I think about how I do not admire people, especially on the radical left, who constantly emphasize the oppression they see in the world. They only see the world through the lens of their own oppression, through the lens of their identity, and how they feel victimized by it. And I think no one victimizes them more than they victimize themselves. And my sister recommended to me that the final step towards transcending colonialism is to forgive the colonizer, to not try to like beat him or best him or, topple him from his throne, like I said in the previous video, but instead to forgive him. Very Christian idea, isn't it? Turn the other cheek. Love your enemy. And over here, this guy, is his name Memmi? I don't know how to pronounce it, but he says, finally, he must cease defining himself through the categories of the colonizers. And I think about this. I think about this idea in relation to like Memmi's idea about how science is neither Western nor Eastern, and there are only two ways of pouring concrete, the right way and the wrong way. Which I think is like, I don't like the example he used there, because the medium for articulating a philosophy is, the medium is the message, the personal is the political, so it's not, I think that's a bad example. But that an idea there is like inherent truth and beauty, and they're just different interpretations of it. And at the end of the day, like, it's kind of absurd to constantly compare. I agree with that, and I think that there are limitations to that. But what I will say is that as my second, and I also, by the way, I've gotten kind of sick of colonialism. Like, half of this book, I was just like, okay, this is interesting, but I'm sick of reading about colonialism. I'm sick of it. I don't want to read about it. Like, it's a lot of abstract theory, makes for good reading material, like in a way a novel might. Not in the same way a novel would achieve that, but like it could engage you deeply, I'm trying to say. And I think that this book failed in that respect. Like, okay, also here's another thing. So it's general. It lacks like an awareness of concerns beyond colonialism, and I think it seems to be like, I find interesting the book didn't make a comparison to gender. I'm not sure why that is, because it felt like a natural comparison to make. Perhaps the consciousness that he was interested in and what was in the popular consciousness at the time didn't reflect that, but that's all the more reason to include it. I just feel like it's a natural progression if you're comparing the colonizer to like the proletariat. That's like a natural thing. I also think that, yeah, he sounds a bit crazy, like I said over here. That's something he shares with Césaire, like very much like that. I like this. I also think it kind of put England down in my eyes. I'm not sure, maybe it seems like maybe that's not the direction you want to go in, like to put the colonizer down, but it just feels so powerful, it just feels so good when I've spent so much of my life worshipping the colonizer in like a very subconscious way at times. So over here it says that the constant removal of the best colonizers explains one of the most frequent characteristics of those who do remain in the colony, their mediocrity. I think that's so true. My sister described England as the dregs of civilization, and not much is happening there in the same way that happens in America, for instance, or France, or other parts of the world that have a cosmopolitanism to them. And I think that's true. And over here, he talks about men of small stature with practically no knowledge of history, politicians given the task of shaping history. That reminds me of the guy I was with, like crazy. I don't know, this book just like, it wasn't trying to do this, but it made me laugh at various points because it reminded me so much of that guy, and it made me like think of him in a different way, because I'd known he was vain. I'd known that there was a pride and bloatedness to him that I did not like, but this guy Memmi was able to articulate it for me in a colonial framework, and because he was able to like Indiana Jones this rope around the statue of the colonizer and bring him down, he also brought down the guy I was with in the process. And I think I'm going to keep reading books on colonialism to remind myself and to keep developing my ideas on it. And it's also an interesting subject. It's instructive and interesting. As I do that, I think that this was a good book to read in that journey, and I'm really proud of myself for actually reading these books. Like, I actually asked ChatGPT, asked Meta AI rather, like, which books would you recommend for understanding colonialism? I mentioned this book to my sister, she'd heard of it, and I think I'm getting a really good understanding, like a basic reading list of this subject. My cousin is really smart and she's watched lots of different movies and read many different kinds of books. And I find it kind of impressive how much she's read of different authors. Like, she's gone in depth in many different authors. That's what she said. And like, I like the idea of being someone like that because I'm very dynamic and I'm finding that I'm channeling this in very cool ways. And I wanted to talk about this book. I wanted to talk about the second I'd finished it, and I wasn't sure whether I'd write an essay or write it in my diary or what way I'd do it. But I knew I wanted to get thoughts out, and I chose this format of this video. I'm not sure why. I think I just wanted to talk about it, and I had finished my cup of tea, so I was feeling like a lot of energy. And being able to talk about a book, it fills you with so much hope, because it's like I gave time to something and I got something out of it, and like, it's possible to keep changing how you think about the world. And yeah, I think it's a book that is important to read if one wants to understand colonialism. And I think that it doesn't make the colonizer as absurd as much as it does cruel. I think that it showcases how colonialism is something that doesn't just upset the balance between good and evil among the colonized. It is something that brings the colonizer down with him. And the same with the patriarchy. People say, these radical third wave feminists say, like, it's also bad for men. Colonialism is also bad for the colonizer. All evil is bad for everybody, and it's especially bad for those who are enacting it. It is bad for the victims, it is bad for the onlookers, and I think it is bad for the people who continue to participate in it. Because I've tried to cultivate a lens of pity. When someone does something, I try and see how they were failed. I think this is a good perspective to have, because when I think of things I've done in my past I'm not very proud of, it helps to have humility and think that maybe a kinder way to see it would be that people failed me in some way, or institutions failed me, or something failed me, and I didn't have the ideal conditions to act the way that I would now with the resources I've cultivated within myself, emotional, cultural, and intellectual. And I think that the same goes for practices like colonialism, when people participate them in the micro ways they do today. Someone failed, Andrew from the Conservative Society. He's so cute, by the way. But someone failed him, and that's why he acts like a coward and interrupts me during my speech. Someone failed the guy that I was with, and that is why he has such shame towards unhappy things. And they should be pitied because there are all these unconscious motives that guide them. Some of them are colonial impulses, and ultimately what the colonizer feels, I think, is just a bit of shame. I do think that he has moments in this book. Memmi has his moments where he does feel a little bit like he speaks about them in such general terms of oppressor and oppression that I think he robs the colonized of their true agency. That's just a criticism of like a subtle thing that I think comes across in this book. For the most part, I'm glad I read it, and I think at some point perhaps I'd also like to reread it. At university, I get these opportunities to negotiate culture, the parts of Pakistani culture that I'd like to develop or renounce entirely. And this book provided me with a helpful framework for what that could look like beyond dress, speech, and habit, how to embody that philosophy internally. And I think that's really cool.